At this hour, Prime Minister Netanyahu is in Washington, about to address both houses of Congress at a critical juncture in the war in Gaza and amid the current drama in U.S. presidential politics. Ahead of the speech, protests by Jewish anti-Israel activists and families of Israeli hostages. ILTV's Steve Leibowitz has the report.
According to sources in the Prime Minister's office, Prime Minister Netanyahu will present Congress with a new strategy against Iran and Hamas. Netanyahu will address the challenges facing Israel, the countries of the region, and the United States from Iran's axis of evil and propose a new way of dealing with the challenges. Prime Minister Netanyahu faced protests in Washington and Tel Aviv ahead of his speech tonight to both houses of Congress. Some 200 left-wing Jewish protesters were arrested while staging a sit-in on Capitol Hill. The group Jewish Voice for Peace organized the protest demanding a halt to military aid to Israel. In a separate protest, dozens of relatives of Israeli hostages protested near the Capitol building. They were demanding that the Prime Minister agree to the conditions for a ceasefire for hostages deal being mediated in Doha.
And now we want to push Netanyahu, our Prime Minister, that we want him to push harder for getting this deal.
There was a mass protest in Tel Aviv as well. Families of hostages and their supporters urged Netanyahu to announce a hostage deal during his address to Congress. Netanyahu's schedule has changed multiple times since the start of the trip. Tomorrow, Netanyahu is due to meet President Biden, who is now back in the White House after testing negative for COVID. Netanyahu would then meet separately with Vice President and likely Democratic presidential candidate Kamala Harris. The Prime Minister was supposed to return to Israel on Friday, but now plans call for a meeting with Republican presidential candidate, former President Donald Trump, in his home in Mar-a-Lago. That means that Netanyahu will not return home to Israel until Sunday.
Well, as the Prime Minister of Israel prepares to speak at U.S. Congress now, we are joined by Mark Schulman, an author and columnist at Newsweek. Welcome to the program, Mark. Glad to have you on. What can we expect to hear tonight from the Prime Minister in his congressional address?
Well, no one fully knows, obviously. He's obviously going to talk about Hamas and the evils that have taken place over this period of time. He's going to call for additional support. I don't mean financial or military, just political support for Israel at this point. I assume he's going to talk about the hostage deal, and he's going to try to talk about something about Gaza after. The report in terms of Iran is an interesting perspective. I frankly think the meetings with President Biden, Vice President Kamala Harris, and President Trump is probably the more important place for those discussions.
Absolutely. We've already seen quite a bit of support on the Iranian issue from Congress already, whereas it's been a little bit more difficult for Netanyahu with the Biden administration thus far. I want to ask you, there's been a lot of talk about boycotting this speech from some of the Democratic senators specifically. How widespread is this animosity on the left and the Democratic left in America?
I think you have to define in two parts. You have the far left, which is just purely anti-Israel, and then you have those people who are basically identifying with many Israelis who would boycott the speech if they were there. So I think that's two groups. I think they're separate groups. Look, the far left in the Democratic Party is basically made up of the progressives, which are probably no more than 10% of the Democratic Party at the top. But look, Netanyahu comes with a lot of controversy. Obviously, there are demonstrators, hostage families are going to be demonstrating as well, and they're not necessarily left-wing. They just think that Netanyahu's policies have been wrong, as do most Israelis at this point. So it's a difficult way to balance the two, and it's unfortunate, really, to have to look at this way and look at the, how many people are not going to be there? What does that say about Israel? It says more about Netanyahu than it does about Israel, generally speaking. And of course, let's keep in mind, this is a terrible time for him to be there in terms of what's going on in America politically. Generally speaking, to show up in the middle of a political campaign is usually a problem. At this particular moment, there's more turmoil in the American political scene than there's been in a long, long time.
Certainly. Well, there's been new polling that has showed that 30% of young Americans believe that Israel is committing a genocide in Gaza. Is this massive disinformation war, is it impacting the members of Congress as well? I mean, we've seen so much ignorance from some of the members of Congress, such as, the Squad, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar. How much is this impacting them?
it impacts them to some extent. Obviously, these are voters, right? So 30% of the young people, those are people who are going to vote for them next time for Senate, or Congress, and everything else. So some of them, depending on the district, are going to be more careful on what they're going to say. They'll make sure they say minimally lip service to what's been going on in Gaza in terms of the number of people who have died. Look, we also have this basic problem is that we've lost the propaganda war because we don't play it. I mean, that's the reality. The amount of effort that goes in by the Israeli government has been minor over all the years, and during this war, even less so. So it's very, very problematic. Disinformation is very, very wide, and we allow disinformation to stay out there. But on top of everything else, there is truth to the fact that people in Gaza, there's no genocide going on, there's no starvation going on, and it takes us a long time to prove there was no starvation. The first time the word of starvation was used, we should have been able to prove the fact that it's not taking place. But once a war gets out there, it keeps on going. But look, there is suffering in Gaza. We can't get away from that. The pictures depict what's going on. Neither you nor I would like to be a Gazan. It's much better to be living in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, wherever we are. And so there's no question we need to also show a little bit of sympathy in that direction. We go a long way in terms of getting additional sympathy and support amongst the American people. Most Americans support Israel. Most Americans support what Israel's done. There is an underlying unease at the suffering they've seen on the television sets.
Absolutely. Well, Mark, I want to thank you for your insights and for joining us on the broadcast today. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Day 292 of the war in Gaza, there has been intense ongoing fighting in Khan Yunis, and the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, said the time is approaching for a hostage for ceasefire agreements.
During the last 24 hours, the forces of Division 98 are operating above and below ground in the Khan Yunis area. Paratroopers and commandos are fighting in the area and destroying terror infrastructure. Visiting the Rafah crossing in Gaza, Defense Minister Gallant told commanders that the focus is on dismantling the Rafah brigade and destroying the tunnels in the area of the Philadelphia axis. The defense minister also told commanders conditions were ripe for a ceasefire for hostages deal.
אנחנו הולכים ויוצרים תנאים למה שרצינו. הדבר הראשון, להכרעתו הצבאית של ארגון חמאס. הדבר השני, בעצם זה שאתם לוחצים, אנחנו הולכים ומקרבים מצב שבו ניתן יהיה להגיע לעסקה של שחרור חטופים. והדבר הזה הוא בזכות הפעולה של הלוחמים. כאן במקום הזה זה
In the north, a soldier was seriously injured by a Hezbollah rocket fired at Har Dov from Lebanon. Several projectiles had been fired at the Har Dov area, along with some 15 rockets launched from Lebanon at the Kiryat Shmona area, some of which were shot down, while others caused damages. The Air Force struck the launcher used by Hezbollah in the Kfar Haman area, as well as an observation post in the Al Khayyam area. Meanwhile, northern residents received the bitter news that the school year will not begin in the northern communities located near the Lebanese border. The towns and villages have been largely evacuated since early October, and residents were hoping that they could return home in time for their kids to return to regular schools in September. Education Minister Kish said, unfortunately, the school year will open this year in the north in a different layout in light of the security complexities in the region.
The Houthi rebels in Yemen are vowing to expand their strikes to include Israeli ports on the Mediterranean. The UN Security Council convened to express concern about potential escalation between Israel and the Houthis following Israel's devastating airstrikes on the Houthi ports and fears of further escalation. More from ILTV's Steve Leibowitz.
Following the Israeli airstrikes on the Houthi rebels in Yemen that followed the drone strike on Tel Aviv, the UN Security Council is now searching for a solution. The UN Special Envoy to Yemen warned of a real danger of devastating regional escalation.
7 months of an escalatory trajectory reached a new and dangerous level last week. I am deeply concerned by the recent military activities in the region, including a drone attack on Tel Aviv by Ansar Allah on 19th of July, and the subsequent Israeli retaliatory attacks on Hodeidah port and its oil and power facilities on the 20th of July. I remain deeply concerned about the continued targeting of international navigation in the Red Sea and its surrounding waterways. Recent developments suggest that the threat against international shipping is increasing in scope and precision.
Meanwhile, the Houthis showed off their drone models that struck Tel Aviv and said that they are preparing to strike new sensitive targets in Israel and the region. The Houthis, in cooperation with other members of the Axis of Resistance, the Iranian-backed paramilitary groups in Lebanon, Iraq, and Syria, say they will hit the Israeli Mediterranean ports of Ashdod, Ashkelon, and Haifa, in addition to the Red Sea port of Eilat. The Houthis have launched missiles and drones at Israel and disrupted global trade through the Red Sea since the start of the war in Gaza.
Despite the crimes against humanity committed by Hamas on October 7th, the terror group met with other Palestinian leadership factions in China to form a unity deal in the future. Let's look closer at what just happened in Beijing. Leaders from multiple Palestinian factions, including Hamas and their rival Fatah, gathered in Beijing for 3 days of China-brokered talks this week. The result was the Beijing Declaration, signed by 14 Palestinian factions, including both Hamas and Fatah. The negotiations also took place even while the terror group holds over 100 Israelis hostage. The unity statement calls for uniting Palestinian institutions in the West Bank and Gaza, as well as calling for national elections.
اتفاقية للوحدة الوطنية نقول بأنه الطريق من أجل استكمال هذا المشوار هو وحدتنا الوطنية، ولذلك نحن نتمسك بالوحدة الوطنية وندعو لها ولا نترك أي شيء يثلم هذه الوحدة الوطنية.
Such a statement is an acknowledgement of Hamas as a legitimate leadership in the eyes of Palestinians and would support joint rule over Gaza post-war, something Israel will never accept. Israel, currently fighting a war to remove Hamas from power in Gaza due to the security threat they pose, strongly condemned the declaration. Israeli Foreign Minister Israel Katz wrote on X that any equation that gives Hamas control in Gaza won't happen because Hamas's rule will be crushed. The declaration did not provide details as to how this new unity effort will operate. The move shows China's keen interest in increasing their influence in the Middle East and portraying themselves as a power broker and alternative to the United States. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi said the agreement was dedicated to the great reconciliation and unity of all 14 factions. The United States, however, was not so enthusiastic. The U.S. State Department said that while it had not reviewed the text of the Beijing agreement, it did not support Hamas having a role in the post-war governance of Gaza. The International Criminal Court has accepted filings from over 60 governments and NGOs regarding arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, and senior Hamas officials. With a tight August 6th deadline for legal positions, the ICC's swift action contrasts with past delays, indicating a significant and expedited review process. ILTV's Mayan Hoffman has more.
The International Criminal Court has agreed to accept filings from over 60 governments and NGOs regarding ICC prosecutor Karim Khan's request for arrest warrants against Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, and 3 senior Hamas officials, including Gaza Chief Yahya Sinwar. The chamber has also set an August 6 deadline for these entities to submit their legal positions on the matter. The process of reviewing and deciding on this large volume of filings is expected to take several months. A senior Israeli legal source revealed that approximately 30 parties, including the U.S., Germany, and the Czech Republic, are supporting Israel. Conversely, around 40 parties, such as South Africa, Spain, Ireland, and Brazil, are opposing Israel. Additionally, Hungary, Argentina, and the Democratic Republic of Congo are also intervening on Israel's behalf. All this according to the Jerusalem Post. The ICC's tight deadline for responses suggests it aims to avoid lengthy delays, contrasting with previous slow-moving cases. A significant issue for the ICC is complementarity. The court cannot intervene if a country is already probing its citizens. The IDF has opened numerous probes into its conduct, potentially preventing ICC prosecution of Israeli soldiers. However, Israel has yet to investigate the legality of War Cabinet officials' decisions. A state commission of inquiry to address this could possibly block ICC arrest warrants.
One of the many things that came to light as a result of the war in Gaza is the indisputable ties between the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, UNRWA, and the Hamas terror group. Repeatedly, members of Hamas have been found to be employees of the UN agency, in some cases even teachers. Now the Israeli Knesset is pushing back with a bill to designate UNRWA as a terror group. Joining us to discuss this bill and the role of UNRWA in general is Israeli member of Knesset Sharon Haskel. Sharon, pleasure to have you on the show as always. What can you tell us about this bill in the Knesset which will designate UNRWA as a terror group, and what would this bill do, practically speaking?
So the main goal, there's a few bills that were passed and they're meant to be joined together. And the main goal is to disconnect the ties between Israel and UNRWA. UNRWA is this organization that sits at the heart of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. If we don't make major changes, reform, or close our ties with them, what happens on the 7th of October, the reality of Israelis and Palestinians, is bound to happen over and over again every few years. UNRWA has a radical Islamist education system that's been radicalizing generations of Gazan and Palestinians, pushing them towards terrorist activities. They have school camps of Hamas funded by UNRWA where they teach literally babies 3 years old, 4 years old, how to stab. How can that be funded from the international community, from the United Nations contributions? And beside that, what we've experienced on the 7th of October by UNRWA's employees, it shouldn't come to a surprise to anyone who knows this organization. There are more than 100 employees that we know that have participated on the 7th of October massacre. And if we take the list of employees and the list of the activists of Hamas, I'm absolutely certain that 70% of the employees in Gaza are either Hamas or their first family members. This is not a United Nations organization. This is not a neutral organization. The United Nations organization are bound legally to work on the principle of neutrality. You cannot tell me that this organization is like that. So better late than never, but we are passing now a legislation that will force the hand of Israel not to continue its ties with UNRWA.
Now, these set of bills that you mentioned, I mean, practically speaking, what will the impact be if we still see international donors pouring money into this agency that's inherently corrupt and, in a way, self-contradictory itself as its mission?
So, first of all, it will create a lot of challenges because, look, Israel is the one that's supplying electricity, for example, for the Gazan citizens. Israel is the one that's supplying water to Gazan citizens, okay? All the goods and the products, you know how Gaza has a border with Egypt? All the goods to build Gaza, to bring, commercial and food and everything, it comes, most of it, from the Israeli border, okay? It means that if UNRWA is trying to communicate or trying to pass its own goods or anything like that, which we know is Hamas, we know these goods are ending up in the hands of Hamas for their own political gain, because through that, they're still controlling the population. The humanitarian aid doesn't go to the poor Palestinians. It goes first to Hamas. They're selling it in the market to pocket that money. So with creating most of these challenges on the communication or the cooperation between UNRWA and Israel, it will create many, many difficulties for these organizations. It means that they're going to have to go through a serious, build-up of infrastructure, etc., which is almost incapable of being built because we know most of the funds, most of the money, most of the equipment that come is being sold by Hamas later on in the international market or the local market, which means it's not going to go anywhere. So it's really putting a serious barrier.
Now, we are almost out of time, but I wanted to ask you about UNRWA more generally. What is this organization's objective, and why do we continue to see this collusion with terrorists? I mean, you mentioned 100 members of Hamas took part in the October 7th massacre, are employees of UNRWA. How is this happening?
So UNRWA is not a refugee organization. That's the greatest mistake that everyone does. I mean, look on the UNHCR. That's a real refugee organization. Their goal are either to resettle okay, the refugees back into the origin, back into their homes or to the lands around their country, or to absorb them in other countries and basically find a better life for them. Like Germany accepted almost 1 million Syrian refugees, and Belgium and France and many other countries. That's the goal of UNHCR. These are the goals of a normal refugee organization. UNRWA is the exact opposite. Okay, UNRWA hasn't resettled or absorbed a single Palestinian refugee. On the contrary, on a contrast to the regular refugee definition of someone who's being displaced or persecuted is being considered a refugee, UNRWA's definition is inheritable. It means that even if your great-great-great-grandfather was a refugee, you still inherit whether you were displaced or not, whether you're poor or a millionaire, whether you even have a German citizenship, you are still being considered a refugee because it's profitable. They made this refugee status a social package that is profitable for them to hold.
Sharon, I'm sorry to cut you off. I think it's actually really important information exposing how much of a scam this organization is, but we are actually out of time for today. So I want to thank you for joining us and shedding some insight on this important development in legislation in Israel. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, Emily.
Since the Hamas attacks on October 7th, American Friends of Sheba Medical Center has stepped up in an extraordinary way. They've raised more than $35 million, ensuring the victims of the massacre and the soldiers who are fighting for Israel continue to receive life-saving treatments and rehabilitation. American Friends of Sheba has arranged for more than 150 volunteers to travel to Israel, providing critical support to the nation's largest and most comprehensive medical center. Be a part of the Sheba. Stand for health. Stand for Israel. Donate now.
The opening ceremony of the 2024 Olympic Games will be held Friday night in Paris. Amid threats of violence, French security is on high alert, prompting the IOC president and French leaders to assure that Israeli athletes and all athletes would be well protected. More from ILTV's Mayan Hoffman.
The International Olympic Committee says that Israel's Olympic team feels comfortable with security measures in place at the Paris Olympics, adding that French forces are collaborating with many countries to safeguard the Games.
With regard to the security of the Israeli athletes, we have the full confidence in the French authorities. First of all, it's the French authorities who are responsible for security. They're working very meticulously. They're working very professionally.
The IOC president said that after the tragedy of the Munich Olympics, Israel takes additional security measures.
The Israeli athletes, since 1972, they always have taken their own additional security measures, and so they did also this time, and they feel comfortable with this situation, as we know from the contact with them.
Demonstrators gathered in Paris to protest against Israel's participation in the Games unless they compete as neutrals without flags, anthems, and emblems. French President Macron weighed in, saying that Israeli athletes, fans, and the political leaders were all welcome in Paris.
Let's take a look at the weather forecast. Mostly clear skies are expected tonight around the country, with warm temperatures reaching lows of 25 degrees Celsius or 77 degrees Fahrenheit. Then tomorrow, sunny skies and hot weather expected, as temperatures will reach highs of 35 degrees Celsius or 95 degrees Fahrenheit. That's a wrap for today's news. For the latest updates from Israel on all your devices, be sure to follow our ILTV channel, subscribe to our newsletter, and explore our website, iltv.tv. Stay informed with the latest news straight from the heart of Israel. I'm Emily Schrader. Be well, and thank you so much for watching.